They whispered she had no value. Margaret lived invisible in her own home, sacrificing dreams for a family that barely saw her. When a stranger appeared with an impossible offer, marriage to a poor man in exchange for saving them all, she accepted her fate. But the quiet stranger who claimed her hand was hiding something far greater than she could imagine. What began as duty would become desire, and the man she thought powerless would reveal a truth that changed everything. The morning light filtered through threadbare curtains, casting pale shadows across Margaret's bedroom. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed, hands folded in her lap, listening to the house wake around her. Footsteps overhead, her younger brother's cough echoing through thin walls, the creak of floorboards as servants moved through halls that had once gleamed with polish but now wore the dull patina of neglect. Margaret was 24 years old, and she had learned to make herself small. She rose and dressed quickly in a simple grey morning dress, its fabric worn soft at the elbows. The mirror on her dresser reflected a woman with dark hair, pulled back severely, eyes the colour of winter sky, and a mouth that had forgotten how to curve upward without effort. She had been beautiful once, people said, before her mother died, before duty consumed everything else. The hallway stretched before her, lined with portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to judge the decay that had crept into their legacy. Margaret moved through the house like a ghost, invisible to those who should have loved her most. In the kitchen, she found Cook preparing a modest breakfast. The older woman looked up with sympathy that made Margaret's chest tighten. "You should not be down here, miss. You are the eldest daughter of this house." Margaret managed a smile that did not reach her eyes. And who else will ensure everything runs smoothly? The truth sat heavy between them. Her father spent his days in his study, drowning in ledgers that showed only debts. Her stepmother had retreated into her own rooms after the last creditor's visit. The younger children knew nothing of how close they stood to ruin. Margaret carried a breakfast tray to her father's study, knocked softly, and entered when she heard his grunt of acknowledgement. Thomas Ashford sat hunched over his desk, looking decades older than his 52 years. Grey streaked his hair. His eyes were red-rimmed from sleepless nights. "Good morning, Father." He barely glanced up. "Is it? I have received another letter from the bank. They want payment by month's end or they will begin seizing property." Margaret set the tray down carefully, her hands steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Perhaps we could speak with Lord Hartley again. He mentioned that his steward might need assistance with his accounts. We have asked too many favours already." Thomas rubbed his face with both hands. "Your mother would be ashamed to see what I have made of her inheritance. Mother would understand that you did your best." The words felt hollow even as Margaret spoke them. She had learned that comfort meant little in the face of devastating reality. Her father looked at her then, really looked, and something like guilt crossed his features. "You should have been married years ago, settled with a good man. Instead, you are here, managing a household that falls apart despite your efforts. I am where I need to be." The lie tasted bitter. Margaret had once dreamed of more, of love, perhaps, of a home that did not feel like a prison built from obligation. But dreams were luxuries she could no longer afford. The morning passed in familiar patterns. She checked on her younger siblings, ensuring they completed their lessons. She met with the housekeeper to discuss which repairs could no longer be delayed. She sat with her stepmother and listened to complaints about the quality of tea they could now afford. By afternoon, Margaret retreated to the small parlour at the back of the house, the only room that still felt like sanctuary. She settled into a chair by the window with a book, though the words blurred before her eyes. Outside, the gardens that her mother had once tended with such care grew wild and untamed. A commotion in the front hall pulled her from her thoughts, voices urgent and unfamiliar. Margaret set her book aside and moved toward the sound, her heart beginning to race with undefined dread. Her father emerged from his study, his expression unreadable. "Margaret, come here, please." She obeyed, joining him in the front hall where a man stood waiting. He was tall, dressed in dark traveling clothes that were clean but unremarkable. His face was angular, strong-featured, with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He was perhaps 27 or 28, though something in his bearing suggested he had lived longer than his years. "This is Mr. Frederick Ward," her father said, his voice strained. He has travelled from London with a proposition. Margaret met the stranger's gaze and felt something shift in the air between them. His eyes were grey like storm clouds before rain, and they held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Ashford." His voice was low, cultured despite his plain appearance. "It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance." "Sir." She managed a small curtsy, her mind racing to understand what kind of proposition would bring a stranger to their door. Her father gestured toward his study. "Let us speak privately." But as Margaret turned to leave, the stranger spoke again. "Actually, if I may, I would prefer Miss Ashford be present. This concerns her directly." The words sent ice through Margaret's veins. She looked to her father, who nodded slowly, defeat written in every line of his body. They settled in the study, Margaret perched on the edge of a worn leather chair while the men remained standing. Her father poured 3 glasses of brandy with shaking hands, though Margaret noticed the stranger did not touch his. "Mr. Ward has made an offer," her father began, then stopped, unable to continue. The stranger, Frederick Ward, took over smoothly. "I understand your family faces financial difficulties. I am prepared to settle your most pressing debts in exchange for a marriage arrangement." Margaret's world tilted. Marriage. To this stranger. The room felt suddenly airless. "I do not understand," she managed. "Why would you make such an offer?" Frederick's gaze remained steady on hers. "I have my reasons. I require a wife quickly, and I believe you would suit my needs. In return, your family's immediate crisis would be resolved." "Your needs." The words came out sharper than Margaret intended. "Am I livestock to be bartered?" Something flickered in Frederick's eyes, gone too quickly to name. "No, miss. You are a woman in an impossible situation, and I am offering a solution that benefits us both." Her father moved to stand beside her chair. "Margaret, I would never force this upon you. But the alternative?" He trailed off, unable to speak the words. Debtor's prison. Homelessness. Her younger siblings turned out onto the street. Margaret looked between the 2 men. The stranger stood with quiet dignity, waiting for her answer without pressure or demand. Her father looked broken, a shell of the man who had once carried her on his shoulders through these very halls. "What kind of man makes such an arrangement?" she asked, needing to understand even as she felt the trap closing around her. "An honest one," Frederick replied. "I will not deceive you about the nature of this arrangement. It is transactional. But I give you my word that you will be treated with respect and that your family will be cared for." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Margaret thought of her mother buried in the churchyard these 5 years. She thought of her brothers and sisters, innocent and unaware of how close they stood to ruin. She thought of her own reflection in the mirror that morning, a woman who had already disappeared into duty. "How much time do I have to consider?" Frederick's expression softened almost imperceptibly. The wedding would need to take place within the fortnight. "I apologize for the haste, but circumstances require it. 2 weeks. 14 days to reconcile herself to a future she had never imagined." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled only slightly. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Ward." Her father made a sound like a wounded animal, but Margaret kept her eyes on the stranger who had just purchased her future. Frederick inclined his head in what might have been respect or acknowledgement. "Thank you, Miss Ashford. I will make the necessary arrangements." As he turned to leave, Margaret found her voice once more. "Mr. Ward, where will we live?" He paused at the door, his back to her. "Not far from here. You will have time to say your goodbyes before we depart." After he left, Margaret stood alone with her father in the study that smelled of old leather and older despair. Thomas reached for her hand, but she stepped away, needing space to feel the full weight of what she had just done. "Margaret, I am so sorry." She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Through the window she watched Frederick Ward climb into a modest carriage and drive away, taking with him the last fragments of the life she might have had. That evening, Margaret sat again in her chair by the parlour window, but the book remained closed in her lap. She watched darkness fall across the overgrown gardens and wondered what kind of man would buy a bride as one might purchase land or livestock. She wondered what kind of woman she would become. Married to a stranger for the price of her family's survival. Most of all, she wondered if she would ever feel anything again, beyond this hollow resignation, this sense of watching her own life from a great distance. The house settled into silence around her. Tomorrow she would tell her siblings. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for a wedding that felt more like a funeral. But tonight, for just a few more hours, Margaret allowed herself to sit in the gathering dark and mourn the death of dreams she had already learned to live without. Outside, the first stars appeared in a sky that cared nothing for the small tragedies of human hearts. The days before the wedding passed in a blur of whispered conversations and sidelong glances. Margaret moved through her remaining time at home like a woman walking toward her own execution, composed on the surface, while something vital withered inside her. Frederick Ward returned 3 days after his initial visit, arriving in the same unremarkable carriage with papers for her father to sign. Margaret watched from the landing as the two men conducted their business in hushed tones, her future reduced to signatures and seals pressed into wax. Miss Ashford. Frederick's voice drew her attention. She descended the stairs slowly, aware of his eyes following her movement. "Might I have a word?" They walked into the small parlor, the door left properly ajar for propriety's sake. Frederick stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the neglected gardens. "I want you to understand that I do not take this arrangement lightly," he said without turning. "I know what I am asking of you." Margaret's hands tightened in the folds of her skirt. "Do you? Do you truly understand what it means to trade yourself for coin?" He turned then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. There was pain there, quickly masked. Perhaps more than you might think. The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken words. Margaret found herself studying him more carefully. His clothes were well made but plain, his manner educated but reserved. There was something deliberately unremarkable about his presentation, as though he had chosen to fade into ordinariness. "Who are you, Mr. Ward?" she asked quietly. "Truly?" A muscle worked in his jaw. "I am a man seeking a wife under unusual circumstances. That is all you need to know for now." The evasion stung more than she expected. "Very well. When do we depart?" "The morning after the ceremony. I have secured a special license. The vicar will perform the service in the village church with your family present. How efficient." Margaret heard the bitterness in her own voice and did not try to soften it. "You have thought of everything." Frederick's eyes darkened. "I have tried to make this as bearable as possible for you. If there is anything you require, anything that would make this transition easier, you need only ask." "What I require is my freedom," she wanted to say. "What I require is a choice." Instead, she lifted her chin and met his gaze. "I require nothing from you but honesty, Mr. Ward. Can you at least give me that? Always." The word came swiftly, firmly. "Whatever else I may be, I will never lie to you." It was a strange promise, weighted with meaning she could not yet decipher. Margaret nodded slowly, accepting it for what it was. The wedding took place on a grey morning that threatened rain. Margaret, dressed in her mother's wedding gown, altered to fit her smaller frame. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, but it was still beautiful, still carried the faint scent of lavender from the trunk where it had been stored. Her stepmother helped arrange her hair, fingers gentle for once. "You look lovely, dear." Margaret stared at her reflection and saw a stranger. The woman in the mirror had dark circles beneath her eyes and a mouth pressed into a thin line. She looked like someone attending a funeral, not a wedding. The church was small and draughty, filled with her family and a handful of curious villagers who had heard rumors of the hasty marriage. Frederick stood at the altar in a dark suit that fit him perfectly, his expression unreadable as Margaret walked down the aisle on her father's arm. "Dearly beloved." The vicar's voice echoed in the stone space. "We are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Margaret barely heard the words. She was acutely aware of Frederick beside her, tall and solid and somehow more present than anyone else in the room. When the vicar asked if she took this man to be her lawfully wedded husband, her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I do." Frederick's response was quiet, but clear. "I do." The ring he slipped onto her finger was simple gold, warm against her cold skin. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Frederick leaned in and pressed a chaste kiss to her cheek, his lips barely grazing her skin. But even that brief contact sent a shock through her system, unexpected and unsettling. The breakfast afterward was a subdued affair. Her siblings clustered around her, too young to understand why their sister looked so pale and lost. Her father drank too much and spoke too little. Frederick stood slightly apart, speaking quietly with the vicar, playing the role of modest gentleman perfectly. Margaret found herself watching him when she thought he would not notice. There was something about the way he moved, the way others seemed to instinctively defer to him despite his plain appearance. Cook had whispered that he must be a merchant or perhaps a gentleman farmer, someone respectable but unremarkable. Yet nothing about Frederick Ward felt unremarkable. As the afternoon waned, Margaret retreated to her bedroom to change into traveling clothes. Her younger sister Emma followed, tears streaming down her face. "Why must you leave so soon?" Emma clutched Margaret's hand. "Cannot you stay just a few more days?" Margaret knelt before the girl, smoothing her hair. "My place is with my husband now, but I will write to you every week, I promise. Will you be happy?" The question pierced her. Margaret had no answer, so she simply pulled Emma into an embrace and held her until the tears subsided. When she descended the stairs for the final time, Frederick was waiting in the hall. He had changed into traveling clothes, and a modest carriage stood ready outside. Not the same one from his previous visits, but similar in its deliberate plainness. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. Margaret looked around at the house where she had grown up, at her family gathered to see her off. Her father's face was etched with guilt. Her stepmother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The children clung together, watching with wide, uncertain eyes. "Yes," she said, though she was not ready at all. Frederick helped her into the carriage, his hand firm and warm through her glove. As they pulled away, Margaret looked back once to see her home growing smaller in the distance. She did not look back again. The interior of the carriage was well appointed, but not luxurious. Frederick sat across from her, giving her space, his long legs angled to avoid brushing against her skirts. "How long is the journey?" Margaret asked, needing to fill the oppressive silence. "Most of the day. We will stop for refreshment along the way." "And where exactly are we going?" "To my home." A pause. "Our home now." The possessive pronoun felt foreign. Margaret turned to gaze out the window at the passing countryside. Spring had come late this year, and the fields were just beginning to show green against the brown earth. Hours passed in near silence. Frederick did not press her for conversation, seemed content to let her retreat into her thoughts. But Margaret found herself hyper-aware of him, of the way his fingers drummed occasionally against his thigh, of the slight furrow between his brows when he thought she was not looking. When they stopped at a coaching inn for refreshment, Frederick handed her down from the carriage with careful courtesy. His hand lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary, and when she met his eyes, something passed between them that made her pulse quicken. Inside the inn, they were shown to a private dining room. The meal was simple but well prepared, and Margaret realized she had not eaten since the morning. Frederick ordered for them both, his manner with the servants polite but carrying an undertone of authority that contradicted his modest appearance. "You are not what you seem," Margaret said suddenly, setting down her fork. Frederick went very still. "What do you mean?" She gestured vaguely. "The way you speak. The way people respond to you. You are educated beyond what your circumstances would suggest." His jaw tightened. "I have been fortunate in my education. That is not an answer." "No." He met her gaze steadily. "It is not. But it is all I can give you at present. Cannot or will not." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone. "You are perceptive, Mrs. Ward." The name struck her like a physical blow. Mrs. Ward. She was no longer Margaret Ashford. That woman had ceased to exist the moment she spoke her vows. Margaret pushed her plate away, her appetite vanishing. "Why me, Mr. Ward? There must be dozens of women in worse circumstances who would have accepted your offer. Why travel all the way to our small corner of the country?" Frederick was quiet for a long moment. "Because I needed someone with dignity, someone who would not be overwhelmed by what I might offer. who would maintain her sense of self regardless of circumstance. And you determined all this from what? Asking questions about my family in the village? Something like that. His eyes held hers, and Margaret saw genuine respect there. You have spent 5 years holding your family together through grief and hardship. You have sacrificed your own future without bitterness or complaint. That speaks to character. You know nothing of my bitterness, she said quietly. Do I not? Frederick leaned forward slightly. You accepted my proposal without dramatics or tears. You stood at that altar with your head high. Even now, angry and uncertain, you maintain your composure. That is not the behavior of a bitter woman, Mrs. Ward. That is the behavior of a strong one. The words settled over her like a cloak, unexpected and strangely comforting. Margaret found she could not look away from him, from the intensity in those storm-grey eyes. Why do you look at me like that? She whispered. Like what? Like you see me. Really see me. Frederick's expression softened. Because I do. The moment hung suspended between them, charged with something Margaret could not name. Then Frederick sat back, breaking the connection, and signaled for the bill. They returned to the carriage as dusk began to fall. The temperature had dropped, and Margaret shivered despite her traveling cloak. Without a word, Frederick removed his own coat and draped it around her shoulders. It was warm from his body and carried his scent, something clean and faintly spiced. Thank you, she murmured. You are my wife now. Your comfort is my responsibility. The words should have sounded cold, transactional. Instead, there was an underlying tenderness that made Margaret's chest tightened. As darkness fell completely, exhaustion finally claimed her. She fought against sleep, unwilling to be vulnerable before this man who was still a stranger. But the rocking of the carriage and the emotional toll of the day proved too much. She woke some time later to find her head resting against Frederick's shoulder. She had somehow crossed the space between them in sleep, seeking warmth. His arm was around her, holding her steady as the carriage jolted over uneven road. Margaret froze, mortified. I apologize, I did not mean to... Sleep, Frederick said softly. We still have hours yet to travel, I do not mind. She should have pulled away, should have retreated to her side of the carriage and maintained proper distance. Instead, Margaret found herself relaxing back against him, too tired to fight the strange comfort of his presence. Frederick's hand moved slowly, carefully, to smooth a strand of hair from her face. The gesture was so gentle, so unexpectedly tender, that Margaret felt tears prick behind her closed eyelids. Who are you? She whispered into the darkness. His chest rose and fell with a deep breath. Someone who will try very hard not to disappoint you. It was not an answer. But as sleep claimed her again, Margaret found herself hoping, despite everything, that it might be true. Margaret woke to pale dawn light filtering through the carriage windows. She was still tucked against Frederick's side, his coat wrapped around her shoulders, his arms steady at her back. For a disorienting moment she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back, and she pulled away quickly, her cheeks burning. Good morning. Frederick's voice was rough with lack of sleep. We should arrive within a few hours. Margaret straightened her dress. You did not sleep. She could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his shoulders from maintaining his position all night so she could rest. I rested enough. There is bread and cheese in the basket beneath your seat. You should eat something. The consideration unsettled her. Margaret retrieved the provisions and ate mechanically, aware of Frederick's occasional glances. The silence between them felt different now, less hostile but charged with unspoken questions. The countryside had changed during the night. Modest farms had given way to larger estates, rolling hills dotted with sheep, ancient trees standing sentinel over stone walls, stretching toward distant horizons. This is beautiful country, Margaret said quietly. It is. Frederick moved to sit beside her, maintaining respectful distance, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. I have always preferred it to London. You know London well? He hesitated. Well enough to know I do not belong there. The carriage slowed as they entered a small village. We will stop here briefly, Frederick said. There are arrangements I need to confirm. He helped her down into the crisp morning air. The village was picturesque, with neat cottages and a church steeple rising above thatched roofs. Margaret noticed immediately how people reacted to Frederick. A woman curtsied. A man inclined his head respectfully. The innkeeper practically bowed. "Mr. Ward, sir, your usual room is prepared." "Thank you, Thomas." Frederick's hand settled at the small of Margaret's back. "My wife will need a few moments to rest as well." The word wife drew curious glances. Frederick led her inside to a private room where fresh water, clean towels and tea waited. "Take your time," he said. "I will be downstairs. If you need anything, simply ask for me." Margaret moved to the wash basin and splashed cold water on her face. She looked different, older somehow. The woman staring back had left girlhood behind, had become someone's wife in the space between one breath and the next. Through the window, she could see Frederick in the courtyard below, speaking with the innkeeper. Even from this distance, she could see how naturally authority sat on him, how others deferred to his judgment. "Who are you, Frederick Ward?" she whispered. When she descended, Frederick was waiting. His eyes swept over her, something warm flickering in their depths. "Better?" "Yes, thank you." As they pulled away from the village, Frederick remained seated beside her rather than returning to the opposite bench. The space between them felt electric. "May I ask you something?" Frederick's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "Of course. Do you regret it? Accepting my proposal?" Margaret turned to look at him fully. She could see vulnerability there, genuine concern. "I regret having no choice," she said honestly. "But do I regret marrying you specifically?" She paused. "I do not yet know you well enough to answer that." "Fair enough. For what it is worth, I will do everything in my power to ensure you do not come to regret it." "Why does it matter to you?" Margaret found herself asking. "If this is merely a transaction, why concern yourself with my feelings?" He was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. Then slowly, he reached across and took her hand. His palm was warm, slightly calloused, and the contact sent sensation racing up her arm. "Because despite the circumstances of our marriage, you are not merely an acquisition to me. You are my wife, and I would have us build something real between us if you are willing." Margaret's heart hammered. She should pull away, maintain distance. Instead, she found her fingers curling around his. "I do not know how to do that with a stranger." "Then let us become less strange to one another." Frederick's thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, the gesture both soothing and maddeningly intimate. "Ask me anything you wish to know." "Where did you grow up?" "In the north, primarily. My father died when I was young. I was educated by tutors and then at university." "Do you have siblings?" "A sister. She is married and lives abroad." "What do you do? How do you make your living?" Frederick's hand tightened briefly. "That is more complicated to explain, but I promise you will understand soon enough." "Always evasions," Margaret murmured, but without real heat. "Not evasions, delays." He raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his eyes never leaving hers. There is a difference. The kiss was brief, proper, nothing that would violate propriety, yet it sent heat flooding through Margaret's body in a way that shocked her. Frederick must have seen something in her expression, because his own face darkened with desire. He released her hand carefully, as though it cost him effort. "Perhaps you should tell me about yourself," he said, his voice slightly rough. "Your favorite things. What you dreamed of before circumstances forced you to set dreams aside." "I loved to read. My mother had a small library, and I spent hours there." "What did you read?" "Everything. Poetry, novels, histories. I particularly loved stories of travel, of places far from England. Would you like to travel?" The question startled her. "I never thought it possible. Our circumstances did not allow for such luxuries. Perhaps now they will. Would that please you?" Margaret studied him, this man who seemed determined to know her thoughts and desires. "Yes," she admitted. "It would please me very much. Then we shall see what can be arranged." The rest of the journey passed in conversation that flowed more easily than Margaret would have thought possible. Frederick asked about her siblings, her childhood, the small details of her life. She found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, small hurts and quiet joys kept private. In turn, he shared carefully curated pieces of himself, his love of horses, his preference for the country, his belief that honor mattered more than title or wealth. "You speak as though you have experience with both title and wealth," Margaret said. Frederick's expression shuddered slightly. "I speak as someone who has observed their effects on people." Another evasion, but Margaret let it pass. The afternoon sun warmed the carriage interior. She found herself relaxing, the tension that had gripped her since accepting Frederick's proposal beginning to ease. When Frederick reached across and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek, Margaret did not pull away. When his hand found hers again, she laced their fingers together without hesitation. The silence between them now was comfortable, intimate. Margaret dozed against his shoulder, waking periodically to find him watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. As evening approached, the landscape changed again. The estates grew larger, roads better maintained. Stone walls gave way to elaborate iron fencing. Through gaps in the trees, Margaret caught glimpses of grand houses set far back from the road. "We are close now," Frederick said quietly. "Very close." Margaret sat up straighter, her heart racing. "What should I expect?" Frederick's hand tightened on hers. "Expect to be surprised. And know that whatever you see, whatever you learn in the next hour, I meant what I said. I will never lie to you, Margaret. I may have delayed certain truths, but I have never lied." The words sent apprehension skating down her spine. What truth could require such careful preparation? The carriage turned onto a long, tree-lined drive. Through the gathering dusk, Margaret could see lights ahead, many lights blazing against the darkening sky. Her new life was waiting, whatever form it might take. And sitting beside her, still holding her hand as though he feared she might disappear, was the man who had brought her here. The stranger who was her husband. The mystery she was only beginning to unravel. The carriage wheels crunched over gravel as they approached the main house. Margaret pressed closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared in disbelief at what lay before her. This could not be right. The building that emerged from the gathering darkness was not a modest country house or even a comfortable gentleman's residence. It was a mansion, 3 stories of pale stone that seemed to glow in the lamplight, with wings extending on either side of a central entrance flanked by columns. Windows blazed with light, dozens of them, casting golden rectangles across manicured lawns that stretched into shadow. "Frederick," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "What is this place?" He was quiet beside her, tension radiating from his body. "This is Ashford Park. Our home. Our home." The words made no sense. Margaret turned to stare at him, searching his face in the dim interior of the carriage. "This cannot be your home. You said you were a man of modest means." "I never said that." Frederick met her gaze steadily, though something like guilt flickered in his eyes. "You assumed it, and I allowed you to believe it." The carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance. Immediately the doors opened and servants appeared, a line of them in crisp livery, waiting with practiced precision. A man who could only be the butler descended the steps with dignified efficiency. Margaret felt her stomach drop. She looked down at her wrinkled traveling dress, at her plain gloves and worn boots. She was about to step out before these immaculately dressed servants, looking like exactly what she was, a woman from a declining family who had no business being here. Frederick's hand found hers in the darkness. "Margaret, look at me." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "You belong here because I chose you." His voice was low but firm. "Not despite who you are, but because of it. Hold your head high as you did at our wedding. Show them the woman I saw when I first came to your home." Before she could respond, the carriage door opened. Frederick stepped out first, then turned and offered his hand. Margaret took it, feeling every eye upon her as she descended. "Welcome home, Your Grace." The words came from the butler, and they hit Margaret like a physical blow. Your Grace, the title reserved for dukes and their families. She looked at Frederick in shock, but he was already moving forward, his hand firm at her back, guiding her up the steps. The servants bowed and curtsied as they passed, their faces carefully neutral. The entrance hall was magnificent. Black and white marble floors stretched before them, reflecting the light from 3 massive chandeliers. A grand staircase curved upward to the floors above, its banister gleaming. Portraits lined the walls, generations of aristocrats staring down with painted eyes. Margaret's legs felt weak. She gripped Frederick's arm, afraid she might collapse. "Your Grace." The butler addressed Frederick directly now. "Shall I have Mrs. Henderson show her Grace to her rooms?" "In a moment, Thompson." Frederick's voice carried the unmistakable tone of authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "First, I would like to introduce my wife properly." He turned to Margaret, and she saw apology written in every line of his face. "Margaret, this is Thompson, who has managed this household for 30 years. Thompson, this is my wife, the new Duchess of Ashford." Duchess. The word echoed in Margaret's mind, making no sense. She was the daughter of a bankrupt gentleman, a woman who had spent 5 years managing a declining household. She was not a duchess. Duchesses were born to the role, trained from childhood, moving in circles so far above her own they might as well be different species. "Your Grace." Thompson bowed deeply. "It is an honor. The entire staff has been eagerly awaiting your arrival." Margaret forced herself to speak, though her voice came out strained. "Thank you, Thompson." A woman in a dark dress and crisp white apron stepped forward. This was clearly the housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a capable air. "If your Grace would like to refresh yourself, I have prepared the Duchess's suite. A bath is being drawn, and your trunks have already been unpacked." "My trunks?" Margaret almost laughed. She had brought one small trunk, containing her few decent dresses and personal items, hardly enough to fill the wardrobe of a duchess. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. That would be most welcome." Frederick's hand tightened on hers. "I will join you for dinner in an hour. We have much to discuss." It was not a request. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak further, and followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with more portraits, elaborate wallpaper, and furniture that looked centuries old and priceless. Mrs. Henderson kept up a steady stream of information about the household, the staff, the routine. But Margaret heard none of it. Her mind was spinning too fast to process anything. "Here we are, Your Grace." Mrs. Henderson opened a door and stood aside. Margaret stepped into rooms that were larger than the entire ground floor of her childhood home. The sitting room was decorated in soft blues and creams, with elegant furniture arranged before a fireplace, where a fire already crackled. Through an open doorway, she could see a bedroom with a canopied bed draped in silk. "The bath is through there." Mrs. Henderson gestured to another door. "I have laid out several dinner gowns for Your Grace to choose from. They belong to the late Duchess, His Grace's mother, and should fit with minor alterations. Tomorrow we will begin arrangements for your own wardrobe, the late Duchess, Frederick's mother." Margaret moved to the window and looked out over grounds that seemed to stretch forever into darkness. Somewhere out there were stables, gardens, tenant farms, all of it belonging to the man she had married, the man who had deliberately deceived her. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" Margaret turned. Mrs. Henderson was watching her with sympathy, as though she understood exactly what Margaret was feeling. "How long have you known about me?" The housekeeper smiled gently. "His Grace wrote 3 months ago, saying he had gone in search of a bride. He wrote again 4 weeks ago saying he had found her. The entire household has been preparing for your arrival. 3 months. Frederick had been planning this for 3 months. He had not stumbled upon her family in desperation. He had sought her out deliberately. Why me?" The question escaped before Margaret could stop it. Mrs. Henderson moved closer, her voice dropping to something more personal than servant to mistress. "If I may speak freely, Your Grace, His Grace has spent years avoiding the marriage his position demanded. The young ladies of his own class pursued him relentlessly, seeing only his title and wealth. He wanted something real, someone who would value him as a man, not as a duke." The words should have comforted Margaret. Instead, they made anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. "So he lied to me, tricked me into believing he was someone he was not. He gave you a choice." Mrs. Henderson's voice remained gentle but firm. He could have revealed his identity and had his pick of desperate families eager to secure the connection. Instead, he offered you an honest arrangement as he understood it. A marriage based on mutual need, rather than deception about feelings neither of you had yet developed. Margaret wanted to argue, but the logic was sound. Frederick had not claimed to love her. He had not promised romance or passion. He had offered security in exchange for companionship, and she had accepted with her eyes open to that reality. What she had not known was the scale of what he was offering. "Your bath is ready, Your Grace. I will return in 30 minutes to help you dress." Alone finally, Margaret sank into a chair and let the full weight of the situation settle over her. She was a duchess, the wife of one of the most powerful men in England. She would be expected to manage this enormous household, to host gatherings of aristocrats, to move in circles where she had no training or experience. She thought of her father's study, of the desperation in his eyes when Frederick had made his offer. Had her father known? Had he recognized the signs of nobility that she had missed? Margaret moved to the bathroom where steam rose from a copper tub filled with hot water. Rose petals floated on the surface, and fine soap and oils were arranged on a nearby table. She undressed slowly, folding her traveling clothes carefully, and stepped into the water. The heat seeped into her muscles, easing the tension from hours of travel, but it could not ease the turmoil in her mind. She had thought she understood the bargain she was making. She had thought she was trading her freedom for her family's survival, marrying a simple man who needed a wife, and offering little beyond basic security. Instead, she had become one of the most highly ranked women in the country. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself sink deeper into the water. Tomorrow she would face Frederick and demand real answers. Tomorrow she would begin to understand what her life had become. But tonight, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel the full force of her fear, her anger, and beneath it all, the dangerous awareness that even knowing Frederick had deceived her, some part of her still responded to his touch, still felt drawn to the man behind the title. That perhaps was the most terrifying realization of all. Margaret stood before the mirror in the Duchess's bedroom, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The dinner gown Mrs. Henderson had selected was exquisite, deep emerald silk that brought out the color of her eyes and fit as though made for her. Her hair had been arranged in an elaborate style she could never have achieved alone, with small pearl pins catching the lamplight. She looked like a duchess, but beneath the fine clothes and careful styling, she felt like an imposter. A knock at the door made her heart jump. Mrs. Henderson entered with a warm smile. "His Grace is waiting in the private dining room, Your Grace. Shall I show you the way?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She followed the housekeeper through corridors that were becoming slightly more familiar, though no less intimidating. They descended a smaller staircase at the back of the house and arrived at a door flanked by 2 footmen who bowed as they opened it. The room beyond was intimate compared to the grandeur she had seen so far. A table was set for 2 before a fireplace, candles casting a soft glow. Windows looked out over gardens barely visible in the darkness. Frederick stood as she entered. He had changed into formal evening wear, black coat and white shirt that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean frame. His dark hair was slightly damp, as though he too had bathed. But it was his expression that caught her attention, the careful neutrality that did not quite hide his apprehension. "Margaret." He moved toward her, then stopped, as though uncertain of his welcome. "You look beautiful." She lifted her chin, channeling every bit of dignity she possessed. "Your Grace." The formal address made him flinch. "Please, not you. I am still Frederick to you." "Are you?" Margaret moved further into the room, putting space between them. "I am no longer certain I know who Frederick is." He gestured to the table. "Will you sit? We should talk." "How gracious of you to finally decide that honesty might be appropriate." The words came out sharper than she intended, years of suppressed feelings breaking through the careful control she had maintained. Frederick absorbed the barb without visible reaction, pulling out her chair and waiting until she reluctantly sat, before taking his own seat. A servant appeared immediately with the first course, delicate soup in fine china bowls. Margaret stared at it. Her appetite vanished. "I owe you an explanation," Frederick began. "You owe me far more than that." Margaret set down her spoon with deliberate care. "You lied to me. I never lied." His voice was quiet but firm. "I chose not to reveal certain truths, yes, but I never once spoke a falsehood to you. Deception by omission is still deception." Margaret met his gaze across the table. "You allowed me to believe you were a man of modest means. You let me think I was sacrificing myself for my family to marry someone barely above them in station, all the while knowing I was becoming a duchess. Would you have accepted if I had told you the truth?" The question hung between them. Margaret wanted to say yes, wanted to claim that honesty mattered more than the scale of the deception, but they both knew the answer. "I would have refused," she admitted. "I would have thought it impossible that you were mocking me or that there was some cruel trick involved." "Exactly." Frederick leaned forward. "Margaret, I am the Duke of Ashford. I inherited the title when I was 19, along with properties across England, investments, responsibilities, and expectations I never wanted. For 12 years, I have been hunted by every ambitious mother with a daughter of marriageable age. I have been schemed against, lied to, and pursued by women who saw only my title and wealth. And so you decided to deceive someone who had no defenses against such manipulation?" His jaw tightened. "I decided to find someone who would choose me for who I am, not what I possess. I wanted a wife who valued character over status, who understood duty and sacrifice, who had the strength to stand beside me rather than behind me." Margaret felt tears prick behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "So you found a desperate woman and exploited her circumstances. How noble of you." "That is not what happened." Frederick's voice rose slightly before he caught himself, taking a breath. "I did not exploit you. I offered you a genuine arrangement. Yes, I concealed my identity, but the marriage was real. The respect I showed you was real. My desire to build something honest between us was real. How can anything between us be honest when it is built on lies?" Frederick stood abruptly, moving to the window. For a long moment he was silent, his shoulders tense. When he spoke again, his voice was raw with emotion she had not heard before. "My father married for duty. He wed a woman chosen by his family, appropriate in every way according to society. They were miserable. They made each other miserable. I watched them destroy each other with polite cruelty for years, until my father's death freed them both. I swore I would never repeat that mistake." He turned back to face her, and Margaret saw pain in his eyes, old wounds that had never fully healed. "I wanted something real, Margaret, something genuine. And yes, perhaps I went about it the wrong way. Perhaps I should have been honest from the beginning and trusted you to see past the title. But I was afraid." He laughed bitterly. "A duke, afraid. How pathetic that sounds." Margaret rose slowly from her chair. "You were afraid I would refuse you. I was afraid you would accept for the wrong reasons, that you would see the title and the wealth and agree to marry me while seeing me as nothing more than a solution to your family's problems." Frederick crossed to stand before her, close enough that she could see the vulnerability in his expression. "At least this way, for a few days, you saw me. Just me. Not the Duke. Not the wealth or the power. Just the man." "And what good does that do us now?" Margaret demanded, though her anger was beginning to crack. "Now I know the truth, and I cannot unknow it. I cannot pretend that nothing has changed. Everything has changed." Frederick reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hands in his. "You are a duchess now, whether you feel ready for it or not. This estate, these people, they are all your responsibility as much as mine. Society will judge you, test you, try to find you wanting." Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. "I do not know how to be a duchess. I can barely manage a small household. How am I supposed to manage all of this?" "You learn, just as I learned." Frederick's grip tightened on her hands. "And you do not have to learn alone. I will be beside you every step. Mrs. Henderson will guide you. The staff will support you. You are not alone in this, Margaret." She wanted to pull away, to retreat into anger because it was safer than the other emotions swirling through her. But the warmth of his hands, the genuine concern in his eyes, made it impossible. "Why me?" she whispered. "With all the women you could have chosen, Women trained for this role. Why did you pick a nobody from a failing family?" Frederick raised one hand to her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she had not realized had fallen. "Because when I watched you in your father's house, I saw strength. I saw a woman who had sacrificed everything for the people she loved without losing herself in the process. I saw dignity in hardship, grace under pressure, and intelligence that no amount of training could instill." His hand moved to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture achingly familiar from their journey. "I saw someone who could stand beside me as an equal, not a subordinate. Someone who would challenge me when I was wrong and support me when I was right. Someone real." Margaret closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of his words, by the sincerity she could hear beneath them. She wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to her sense of betrayal. But standing here with Frederick's hands warm on her skin, she could not deny the truth. She had felt something developing between them during their journey. Something that had nothing to do with titles or wealth, and everything to do with the man before her. "I am terrified," she admitted, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "I am so far out of my depth I cannot even see the surface anymore." "I know." Frederick's expression softened. "And I am sorry. Sorry that I brought you here unprepared. Sorry that I did not trust you with the full truth from the beginning. Sorry that my attempt to find something real has put you in this position." He paused, searching her face. "But I am not sorry I chose you, and I will spend however long it takes proving to you that you can do this, that you belong here, that you are exactly the Duchess this family needs." Margaret felt something shift inside her, anger giving way to something more complicated. She was still hurt, still overwhelmed. But beneath it all, she recognized the truth in his words. "I need time," she said quietly. "Time to process all of this. Time to understand what my life has become. Take all the time you need." Frederick released her hands, though she could see it cost him effort. "I will not press you. We can maintain separate rooms, live separate lives if that is what you require. I will give you space to adjust." Margaret nodded slowly, exhaustion suddenly crashing over her. The emotional toll of the day, of the revelations, had left her drained. Frederick must have seen it because he immediately moved to the door. "Let me have Mrs. Henderson escort you back to your rooms. You should rest." As the housekeeper appeared and led her away, Margaret looked back once to see Frederick standing alone in the dining room, his expression unguarded for just a moment. He looked lost, uncertain, painfully human despite the ducal title. It was that glimpse of vulnerability that stayed with her as she prepared for bed in her new rooms. As she lay in the enormous canopied bed, staring up at silk hangings she could barely see in the darkness. She had married a stranger who had become a duke. But perhaps underneath it all there was still the man who had held her gently in the carriage, who had asked about her dreams, who had looked at her as though she mattered. Perhaps that man was worth forgiving. Before you continue to the next chapter, I would love to hear from you. If this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And here is something I am curious about. If you could ask Frederick one question right now, what would it be? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your words truly inspire me to keep creating these stories for you. Morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, waking Margaret to unfamiliar surroundings. For a disorienting moment she forgot where she was. Then memory crashed back, bringing with it the weight of her new reality. She was the Duchess of Ashford. A soft knock at the door preceded the entrance of a young maid carrying a tray. "Good morning, Your Grace. I am Sarah, your lady's maid. Mrs. Henderson thought you might appreciate breakfast in your rooms this morning." Margaret sat up slowly, accepting the situation because she had no choice. "Thank you, Sarah." The girl set the tray on a table by the window and moved to open the curtains fully. The view that appeared made Margaret's breath catch. Gardens stretched in every direction, elaborate designs of hedges and flower beds, paths winding between fountains and statuary. Beyond she could see woods and open parkland, rolling toward distant hills. "His Grace requested that I inform you he will be in his study all morning attending to estate business," Sarah said as she poured tea. "He hopes you might join him for luncheon at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, Mrs. Henderson is available to show you the house whenever you are ready." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. After Sarah left, She ate mechanically, her mind turning over the events of the previous evening. Frederick's confession, his vulnerability, the pain she had seen beneath his careful control. She should still be angry. Part of her was. But another part, the part that had felt something developing between them during their journey, understood his reasoning even if she could not yet forgive the deception. An hour later, dressed in a day gown that had also belonged to Frederick's mother, Margaret met Mrs. Henderson in the corridor. The housekeeper's smile was warm and reassuring. "Shall we begin with the main floor, Your Grace? It can be overwhelming at first, but you will find your way soon enough." They spent the morning moving through endless rooms. A formal dining room that could seat 40, a ballroom with crystal chandeliers and mirrors that multiplied the light, a music room with a pianoforte and harp, a library that made Margaret's heart ache with longing, walls lined floor to ceiling with books. "This was His Grace's mother's favorite room," Mrs. Henderson said softly, watching Margaret's expression. "She spent hours here. His Grace mentioned that you also love to read." The consideration touched her. Despite everything, Frederick had been paying attention to her words, to the small details she had shared about herself. They continued through conservatories and drawing rooms, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors and delicate porcelain collections. At every turn, servants stopped to bow or curtsy, their faces curious but respectful. By the time they returned to the main hall, Margaret's head was spinning. "How does anyone remember where everything is?" "You will, Your Grace." Mrs. Henderson's smile was kind. "Give yourself time." His Grace's mother felt the same way when she first arrived. She used to get lost regularly for the first month. The idea that even someone born to aristocracy had struggled with this transition eased some of Margaret's anxiety. "Tell me about her." Frederick's mother. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened with memory. She was a remarkable woman. Kind, intelligent, and stronger than most people realized. She loved His Grace deeply. Though she and the late Duke were not well matched, she made this house a home despite that difficulty. Margaret heard the unspoken message. Frederick's mother had survived an unhappy marriage and still found ways to create meaning in her life. Perhaps there was hope in that. At precisely 1 o'clock, a footman escorted Margaret to a small dining room she had not seen during the morning tour. Frederick was already there, standing by the window. He turned as she entered, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. "Margaret." He moved toward her, then stopped, maintaining careful distance. "Did you sleep well?" "Eventually." She allowed him to seat her, hyper-aware of how his hand briefly touched her shoulder. "The house is extraordinary. Mrs. Henderson gave me a tour this morning." "Did she?" "I hope it was not too overwhelming." They fell into silence as servants brought the first course. Margaret focused on her plate, feeling the weight of Frederick's gaze. When she finally looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that stole her breath. "What are you thinking?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Frederick set down his fork carefully. "That you look beautiful in that color. That I wish I could read your thoughts. That I am terrified you will never forgive me for putting you in this position." The raw honesty disarmed her. "I am trying to understand," she said quietly. "Your reasons make sense, even if I wish you had trusted me with the truth sooner. Would you have believed me?" Frederick leaned forward slightly. "If I had told you on that first day that I was a duke, that I could give you everything you might ever want, would you not have thought it some cruel jest?" Margaret considered this. "Perhaps. Yes, probably." Then we were at an impasse. He held her gaze. "I made the choice I thought would give us the best chance at something real. I stand by that choice, even knowing it hurt you. You are infuriatingly logical." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "It is a failing of mine." The tension between them eased slightly. They ate in more comfortable silence, occasionally venturing small comments about the food or the weather. But Margaret felt the awareness crackling between them, an invisible thread connecting them despite the space. After lunch, Frederick stood. "Would you walk with me? I thought I might show you the gardens." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. A footman appeared with her wrap, and moments later they were descending the terrace steps into the elaborate grounds. The afternoon was mild, sun breaking through scattered clouds. Frederick offered his arm. and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret took it. The contact sent warmth spreading through her despite the layers of fabric between them. They walked in silence along gravel paths between perfectly maintained beds of roses and lavender. The scent surrounded them, sweet and calming. Other couples might have filled the quiet with meaningless chatter, but Margaret found she did not mind the companionable silence. Frederick led her to a fountain at the center of a circular garden. Water cascaded from tiers of carved stone, the sound soothing. They stopped, standing close together at the fountain's edge. "My mother planted these roses," Frederick said, gesturing to the bushes surrounding them. "She said every duchess should leave her mark on the gardens. I thought perhaps you might want to add your own section." Margaret looked at him in surprise. "You would trust me to change your mother's gardens. They are your gardens now." His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "Everything here is yours, Margaret. I want you to make it your home, not just endure it as a prison." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. She turned to face him fully and found him closer than she expected. Close enough to see gold flecks in his grey eyes, to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Frederick." His name came out barely above a whisper. "Yes?" He raised his hand slowly, telegraphing the movement, giving her time to pull away. When she did not, his fingers brushed her cheek, tucking back a strand of hair the breeze had loosened. The touch ignited something in Margaret, desire mixing with confusion and fear and hope. She should step back, maintain proper distance. Instead, she found herself swaying toward him. "Margaret, if you do not want this, tell me now." Frederick's voice was rough, strained. "Because I am very close to forgetting every proper rule about giving you time and space." "I do not know what I want," she admitted. "Everything is happening so fast. I feel like I am drowning. Then let me be your anchor." His other hand came up to frame her face, his touch gentle despite the intensity in his eyes. "You do not have to decide everything today. We can take this slowly, learn each other properly. And if I discover I cannot forgive the deception?" Pain flashed across his features. "Then I will live with that consequence. But Margaret, I need you to know that what I feel for you is real. Title and wealth aside, I am drawn to you in ways that terrify me." His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, and Margaret felt her resolve cracking. She had tried to maintain anger, to hold the deception as a shield between them. But standing here in the garden with Frederick's hands gentle on her face and his eyes dark with barely restrained desire, she could not deny the truth. She wanted him. Wanted this. Whatever this was becoming. Frederick must have seen something change in her expression because his breathing quickened. His gaze dropped to her lips, and Margaret felt heat pool low in her belly. He was going to kiss her. She knew it with absolute certainty, and she knew she was going to let him. But at the last moment, Frederick pulled back, his hands falling away. His jaw was tight with the effort of restraint. "Not yet," he said roughly. "When I kiss you, Margaret, it will be because you want me to, not because you are confused or overwhelmed. It will be a choice you make with clear eyes and an open heart." The nobility of it frustrated her even as it made her respect him more. "You are making this very difficult, Your Grace." "Good." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "You have made things difficult for me since the moment we met. It is only fair." They stood there for a long moment, the air between them charged with everything unspoken. Then Frederick offered his arm again, and they continued their walk through the gardens. But something had shifted. Margaret felt it in the way Frederick's hand occasionally brushed hers, in the heated glances they exchanged, when they thought the other was not looking. The careful distance they had maintained was eroding, replaced by an awareness that made every innocent touch feel weighted with promise. By the time they returned to the house, Margaret's skin felt too tight, her breathing shallow. Frederick's eyes had darkened to storm grey, his careful control clearly fraying. At the door to her rooms, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that burned through her glove. "Sleep well, Margaret." She could only nod, not trusting her voice. As she closed the door behind her, she leaned against it, her heart racing. This was dangerous. She was falling for him, for the man behind the title, and she had no idea if that was the wisest or most foolish thing she had ever done. 3 weeks had passed since Margaret's arrival at Ashford Park. 3 weeks of learning the rhythms of the household, of slowly finding her place in this new world. 3 weeks of growing closer to Frederick in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. They had fallen into a pattern. Mornings apart, attending to their respective duties. Afternoons together, walking the gardens or riding through the estate. Evenings spent in the library, reading side by side in comfortable silence, occasionally broken by conversation that grew increasingly personal. The desire between them had become a living thing, palpable in every glance, every accidental touch. But Frederick maintained his promise, never pushing, always giving her space to choose. It was maddening and honorable in equal measure. Margaret was reviewing household accounts in the morning room when Mrs. Henderson appeared, her expression troubled. "Your Grace, you have visitors. Lady Penelope Hartwick and her mother, the Countess of Westmore." They arrived without notice, claiming acquaintance with His Grace. Something in the housekeeper's tone put Margaret on alert. "Should I receive them?" "It would be expected, Your Grace, but perhaps I should inform His Grace first." "No." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "I am the Duchess of this house. I will receive our guests appropriately." Mrs. Henderson's expression filled with approval. "Very good, Your Grace. I will have them shown to the blue drawing room." Margaret took a moment to check her appearance in the mirror. The deep burgundy day dress was elegant and well-fitted, her hair arranged in a style she had finally mastered with Sarah's patient instruction. She looked the part of a duchess, even if she still sometimes felt like an imposter. The blue drawing room was one of the more formal receiving spaces. 2 women waited there, both dressed in the height of London fashion. The older woman, the Countess, was handsome and imposing. But it was the younger woman who captured attention. Lady Penelope was beautiful in the classical sense. Golden hair, porcelain skin, features that might have been painted by a master. She stood with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. "Your Grace." The Countess curtsied with precise correctness, her eyes assessing Margaret with barely concealed curiosity. "Thank you for receiving us without notice. We were passing through the area and simply could not resist calling on dear Frederick. The use of his given name was deliberate, establishing familiarity." Margaret kept her expression pleasant. "Lady Westmore, Lady Penelope, welcome to Ashford Park. Please sit." As they settled, a footman appeared with tea. Margaret poured with hands that remained steady despite her racing heart. She could feel both women studying her, cataloguing every detail to be dissected later. "We were so surprised to hear of Frederick's marriage," Lady Penelope said, her voice light but with steel underneath. "He never mentioned being in search of a bride when we saw him in London last season." "His Grace values his privacy," Margaret replied evenly. "Our courtship was conducted away from society's scrutiny." How romantic. The younger woman's smile did not reach her eyes. "And yet, we have heard so little about you, Your Grace. Your family is from the north." The question was designed to expose Margaret's inferior connections. She met Lady Penelope's gaze directly. "My family's estate is in the countryside, yes. A quiet life, but one that suited me well. Until you caught a duke's attention." Lady Penelope's tone made it sound like an accusation. "Until His Grace and I found we were well suited to each other," Margaret corrected, gently but firmly. The Countess leaned forward, her expression sympathetic in a way that felt calculated. "My dear, you must understand. Frederick's position requires a certain level of social expertise, managing a ducal household, hosting society events, navigating the complexities of the peerage. It can be quite overwhelming for someone without proper training." "I am learning quickly," Margaret said, refusing to be cowed. "But can you learn quickly enough?" Lady Penelope's mask of politeness slipped slightly. "Frederick has responsibilities to his title, to his family name. The Duchess of Ashford must be above reproach in society's eyes. She must be someone who elevates his standing, not diminishes it." The cruelty beneath the words was unmistakable now. Margaret felt anger rising but kept her voice level. "I assure you, Lady Penelope, I take my responsibilities as Frederick's wife very seriously." "Do you?" The younger woman stood, moving to the window with studied grace. Or did you simply see an opportunity to escape obscurity and seize it? Frederick is too honorable to see how he has been manipulated, but others are not so blind. That is enough. Margaret rose as well, her voice sharp with authority she had not known she possessed. You will not insult me in my own home. Whatever relationship you believe you have with His Grace, it does not give you the right to question his judgment or my integrity. Lady Penelope turned, surprise flickering across her perfect features. You do not understand what you have taken from me. I have taken nothing. Margaret moved closer, holding the other woman's gaze. Frederick made his choice freely. If you cannot accept that with grace, then perhaps you should leave. Penelope, darling, we should go. The Countess stood quickly, clearly recognizing the situation had deteriorated beyond repair. We have overstayed our welcome. But Lady Penelope was not finished. She crossed to stand directly before Margaret, voice dropping to something more personal, more poisonous. You think you know him. You think these few weeks have shown you who Frederick really is. But I have known him for years. I was meant to be his Duchess. Everyone expected it. And when society discovers what you really are, a nobody from nowhere who trapped him with her circumstances, they will destroy you. You will never be accepted. You will make him a laughingstock. Each word was designed to wound, to plant seeds of doubt. Margaret felt them hit home, felt the fears she had tried to suppress rising to the surface. But she refused to let this woman see her pain. Are you finished? Lady Penelope's eyes widened slightly at the ice in Margaret's tone. Good. Margaret moved to the door and opened it. Thompson was already waiting, having clearly anticipated the need. Thompson, please show our guests out. They will not be returning. Your Grace, I must protest, the Countess began. There is nothing to protest. Margaret kept her voice calm but implacable. You are no longer welcome at Ashford Park. Should you attempt to call again, you will be turned away at the gate. Lady Penelope's face flushed with fury and humiliation. Frederick will hear about this. Yes, Margaret agreed. He will. From me. She stood at the door, watching as the two women were escorted out, their backs rigid with outrage. Only when their carriage had disappeared down the drive did Margaret allow herself to move. Her legs felt weak. She made it to a chair before they gave out entirely, sinking into it as the full impact of the confrontation hit her. Lady Penelope's words echoed in her mind. A nobody from nowhere who trapped him. You will never be accepted. You will make him a laughingstock. Were they true? Had she been fooling herself these past weeks, thinking she could become what Frederick needed? The cruelty of the attack had shaken something loose inside her, and suddenly all her insecurities came flooding back. Margaret. Frederick's voice startled her. She looked up to find him in the doorway, concern etched across his features. Thompson informed me what happened. Are you all right? She wanted to say yes, to maintain the dignity she had shown Lady Penelope. Instead, words tumbled out before she could stop them. Is she right? Am I going to destroy your standing in society? Will people always see me as someone who does not belong? Frederick crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to his knees before her chair. His hands captured hers, his eyes fierce. Margaret, listen to me. Penelope Hartwick is a bitter woman who believed she had a claim on a future that was never promised to her. Every word she spoke was designed to hurt you, to make you doubt yourself. But she knows this world. I do not. Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. What if she is right? What if I cannot be what you need? Frederick's hands tightened on hers. You are already what I need. You are strong, intelligent, compassionate. In 3 weeks, you have won over every servant in this household. Mrs. Henderson tells me you have been visiting tenants, learning their names, their families. That is what makes a good duchess, Margaret. Not perfect manners or aristocratic breeding. Society will judge me harshly. Let them. His voice was rough with emotion. I do not care what society thinks. I care about you, about us, about building the life we discussed. Anyone who cannot accept you is not welcome in our home or our lives. Margaret searched his face, seeing only sincerity and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. You truly mean that. Every word. Frederick raised one hand to her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. I am sorry she hurt you. Sorry that my past associations have brought this pain to your door. But Margaret, you must know that there is no one else. There has never been anyone else. Not really. What about Lady Penelope? There must have been something between you. Expectation, Frederick said flatly. Her family's expectation, society's expectation. Never mine. I never courted her, never gave her reason to believe I would offer for her. But some people see what they wish to see, regardless of reality. He stood, pulling Margaret to her feet with him. His hands framed her face, thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized had fallen. You are my wife, my choice, my Duchess. And I will not let anyone, not Penelope Hartwick or anyone else, make you doubt that you belong here. Margaret felt something break open inside her, all the fear and doubt of the past weeks crystallizing into clarity. Lady Penelope's cruelty had accomplished the opposite of its intention. Instead of driving a wedge between them, it had shown Margaret exactly how much Frederick valued her, and how much she had come to value him. "Frederick," she whispered, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. His breath caught, his eyes darkening as he understood her intention. "Are you certain?" His voice was strained with the effort of restraint. For the first time since arriving at Ashford Park, Margaret was absolutely certain of something. Yes. Frederick's control shattered. His mouth found hers with a hunger that had been building for weeks, and Margaret met him with equal intensity. The kiss was everything she had imagined, and nothing she could have prepared for. Deep, demanding, stealing the breath from her lungs and replacing it with fire. His hands moved from her face to her waist, pulling her closer until no space remained between them. Margaret's fingers tangled in his hair, holding him to her as though afraid he might pull away again. But Frederick showed no sign of retreating. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were almost black with desire. Margaret. Her name came out rough, reverent. "If we continue, I will not want to stop. Then do not stop." Margaret had never been so certain of anything. "I choose this. I choose you." Something fierce and possessive flashed across his features. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Come with me." He led her through corridors she was still learning, up the grand staircase to the ducal chambers. Margaret's heart raced, but not with fear, with anticipation, with need, with the overwhelming rightness of this moment. Frederick's rooms were masculine and elegant, dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in deep blue velvet. He closed the door behind them, then turned to face her. "Are you certain, Margaret? Once we cross this line, everything changes. It has already changed." She moved to stand before him, raising her hands to his chest. "From the moment you walked into my father's house, everything changed. I am tired of fighting what I feel." "And what do you feel?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I feel seen by you, valued, desired. I feel like the woman I was always meant to be, but never had the chance to become. And I feel something for you that terrifies me because it is so much more than I expected." Frederick's hands came up to frame her face again, his touch unbearably gentle. "I love you, Margaret. I have been falling in love with you since that first conversation in your father's parlor. I tried to tell myself it was too soon, that I should wait, but I cannot keep it inside any longer." The words washed over her like sunlight breaking through clouds. Margaret felt tears spill over, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of recognition. "I love you too." The admission felt like freedom. I did not want to. I tried not to. "But Frederick, I love you so much it frightens me." "Do not be frightened." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, the corner of her mouth. "I have you. I will always have you. Then have me now." Frederick needed no further encouragement. His mouth claimed hers again as his hands moved to the buttons at the back of her dress. His fingers worked with surprising dexterity, and Margaret felt the fabric loosen, sliding from her shoulders. She reached for his coat, pushing it off, then worked at his waistcoat and shirt with trembling fingers. Each layer removed revealed more of him, and Margaret found herself breathless at the sight. He was beautiful, all lean muscle and warm skin. When they finally stood before each other with nothing between them, Frederick paused, his eyes traveling over her with such reverence that Margaret felt no shame, only power. "You are extraordinary." His voice was hushed, worshipful. As are you. He lifted her in his arms, carrying her to the bed, and laying her down on silk sheets that felt cool against her heated skin. Then he was beside her, his body covering hers, skin against skin, and Margaret gasped at the sensation. Frederick took his time, kissing a path down her throat, across her collarbone, learning every curve and hollow of her body. His hands followed the same path, gentle but sure, awakening sensations Margaret had never imagined. She touched him in return, marveling at the play of muscle beneath her palms, at the way his breath caught when her fingers traced certain paths. This was intimacy she had never understood, a giving and taking that transcended the physical. When Frederick positioned himself above her, his eyes found hers. "I love you, Margaret. I love you." He entered her slowly, carefully, watching her face for any sign of discomfort. There was a moment of sharp sensation, quickly fading, and then only fullness, connection, rightness. They moved together, finding a rhythm that was uniquely theirs. Frederick's forehead rested against hers, their breathing mingling as their bodies joined. Margaret wrapped herself around him, holding him as close as possible, wanting to memorize every sensation. The pleasure built gradually, a wave that grew with each movement. Frederick's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together above her head as he moved within her. His other hand caressed her face, her hair, every touch a declaration of love. Margaret felt herself climbing towards something she could not name, tension coiling tighter and tighter, until she thought she might shatter. Frederick sensed it, his movements becoming more purposeful, his voice rough in her ear, encouraging her to let go. When release finally came, it swept through Margaret like a storm, stealing her breath and her thoughts, leaving only sensation and Frederick's name on her lips. A moment later, she felt him follow, his body tensing above hers before he collapsed beside her, pulling her close against his chest. They lay tangled together, hearts racing, skin damp with exertion. Frederick's hand traced lazy patterns on her back, soothing and intimate. Margaret pressed her face against his shoulder, breathing in his scent, feeling completely safe for the first time since arriving at Ashford Park. "Are you all right?" Frederick's voice rumbled through his chest. Margaret lifted her head to look at him. "I am more than all right, I am perfect." His smile was tender, transformative. "Yes, you are." She settled back against him, her fingers tracing the planes of his chest. "That was nothing like I expected. Better or worse? So much better." Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks but forced herself to continue. The books make it sound painful and awkward. That was neither. Frederick's hand tipped her chin up so she met his eyes. It should never be painful, not when both people care for each other. And it will only get better as we learn what pleases each other. The promise in his words sent a fresh wave of desire through Margaret. "Already?" Frederick's laugh was low and pleased. "Perhaps not immediately, but soon." He rolled, pulling her on top of him so she straddled his waist. "For now I simply want to hold you, to look at you, to convince myself this is real." Margaret leaned down, her hair falling around them like a curtain. "This is real. I am real. We are real. Finally." He pulled her down for a kiss that was slower, sweeter, but no less passionate. "Finally, you believe it." They made love again, as moonlight began to filter through the windows. Slower this time, exploratory. Frederick mapped every inch of her body with hands and mouth, finding places that made her gasp and sigh. Margaret grew bolder in return, discovering what made his breathing quicken, what brought that fierce light to his eyes. Afterward, they lay wrapped around each other, exhaustion finally claiming them both. Frederick's hand never stopped moving, stroking her hair, her back, as though he needed the constant contact to believe she was real. "Stay," he murmured against her hair. "Do not go back to your rooms. Stay here with me." "Always," Margaret promised, already drifting towards sleep. "I will always stay." The last thing she felt before sleep claimed her was Frederick's lips pressed against her forehead, and the whispered words that sealed what they had become to each other. "My love, my wife, my Margaret." In the darkness of the ducal chambers, wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret and Frederick crossed the final bridge from strangers bound by arrangement to lovers bound by choice. What had begun with deception and necessity had transformed into something neither of them had dared hope for. Real love, true partnership, a future built not on duty, but on desire freely given and joyfully received. Outside, storm clouds that had been gathering all evening finally broke, rain pattering against the windows. But inside, warm and safe and loved beyond measure, Margaret felt only peace. She had come to Ashford Park as a sacrifice. She had stayed as a duchess. But tonight she had become something far more important. She had become Frederick's heart. And he had become hers. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the warmth of Frederick's body beside hers. For a moment, she simply lay still, savoring the feeling of being held, of being loved, of being exactly where she belonged. Frederick's arm tightened around her waist, and she felt his lips press against her shoulder. "Good morning, my love." She turned in his embrace, finding him already awake and watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "Good morning." They spent the morning in Frederick's chambers, talking and laughing, and occasionally losing themselves in kisses that threatened to become more. It was Sarah's discreet knock at the door that finally reminded them of the world beyond their private sanctuary. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion, but you have correspondence that requires immediate attention." Frederick sighed against Margaret's hair. The duties of a duke wait for no man, not even one newly and thoroughly in love. Margaret laughed, pushing him gently away. "Go. Attend to your responsibilities. I should return to my own rooms before the entire household knows where I spent the night." "They already know," Frederick said with a grin, "and they could not be happier about it. Mrs. Henderson has been predicting this outcome since the day you arrived. Still," Margaret rose, wrapping a sheet around herself, "propriety demands some discretion." Frederick stood as well, pulling on a dressing gown before coming to stand before her. His expression grew serious. "Margaret, there is something we must discuss. Lady Westmore and Lady Penelope will undoubtedly spread word of your encounter with them. By week's end, half of society will have heard some version of events. Let them talk. They will do more than talk." Frederick's jaw tightened. "They will use this as an opportunity to question your suitability, to undermine your position. We must be prepared to face this together. Then we will face it together." Margaret reached up to touch his cheek. "I am not afraid anymore, Frederick. Not of society, not of their judgment. You love me, and I love you. That is all that matters." His smile was fierce with pride. "That is exactly the attitude we will need, because in 3 days, we are hosting a ball." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "A ball?" "The autumn ball at Ashford Park is a tradition. Invitations were sent months ago, long before I met you. Every notable family in 3 counties will attend." Frederick took her hands. "It will be your formal introduction to society as my Duchess. I will not lie to you, Margaret. It will be difficult. People will judge you, test you, look for any sign of weakness, then I will give them none. That is my Duchess." He pulled her close for a fierce kiss. "We will show them exactly what they are dealing with. A woman of strength, intelligence, and dignity who has earned her place at my side." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Mrs. Henderson oversaw the transformation of Ashford Park into a venue fit for the event. The ballroom was cleaned until the chandeliers sparkled and the floor gleamed. The kitchens worked around the clock, preparing elaborate dishes. Flowers were brought in by the cartload. Margaret threw herself into the preparations, working alongside Mrs. Henderson to ensure every detail was perfect. She met with the housekeeper, the cook, the head gardener, making decisions with growing confidence. The staff, who had already warmed to her, became fiercely loyal as they watched her work tirelessly. "Your mother would be proud," Mrs. Henderson told her on the evening before the ball. "You have become a true Duchess, Your Grace, not through birth, but through character." The words meant more to Margaret than any compliment about her appearance or manners ever could. On the night of the ball, Sarah helped Margaret dress in a gown that had been commissioned especially for the occasion. Deep sapphire silk that brought out the blue in her eyes, cut in the latest London fashion, with delicate embroidery at the bodice and hem. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style, adorned with pearls that had belonged to Frederick's mother. When Margaret descended the stairs to where Frederick waited, his expression made every moment of preparation worthwhile. He stared at her as though seeing something divine. "You are breathtaking. As are you." Frederick wore formal evening attire that emphasized his commanding presence. Together, they looked every inch the ducal couple they were meant to be. "Remember," Frederick said quietly as they moved toward the ballroom, "we face this together. If anyone steps out of line, if anyone treats you with disrespect, I will address it immediately." "I can handle myself," Margaret said with more confidence than she felt. "I know you can. That is why I love you." The ballroom was already filling with guests when they entered. Conversation faltered as people turned to stare at the new Duchess of Ashford. Margaret felt the weight of their scrutiny, but kept her head high, her hand steady on Frederick's arm. "The Duke and Duchess of Ashford," Thompson announced with perfect formality. They descended into the ballroom, and Margaret immediately spotted Lady Westmore and Lady Penelope among the crowd. Both women wore expressions of barely concealed hostility. The evening began with the traditional opening dance. Frederick led Margaret onto the floor, and as the music started, she lost herself in the familiar steps. Dancing had been one of the few accomplishments her mother had insisted upon, and Margaret moved with natural grace. "You are magnificent," Frederick murmured as they turned. "Every man in this room envies me, and every woman wishes she were you. I only care what you think. Then know that I think I am the most fortunate man alive." As the dance ended, Frederick tucked Margaret's hand into the crook of his arm and led her through the crowd, making introductions. Most guests were polite, if reserved. But Margaret could feel the undercurrent of judgment, the whispered speculation. Then Lady Penelope appeared, her mother at her side. "Your Grace." Lady Penelope's curtsy was perfect, her smile poisonous. What a charming ball! Though I confess I was surprised to receive an invitation after our last encounter. "You are a guest in my home," Margaret said evenly. "I trust you will behave accordingly." "Of course." Lady Penelope's eyes glittered with malice. "I was just telling Lady Ashworth about your fascinating background. A country estate fallen on hard times, was it not? How fortunate that His Grace happened upon you just when you needed rescuing." The implication was clear. Margaret felt anger rise but kept her voice level. "His Grace did not rescue me, Lady Penelope. He chose me. There is a difference." "Is there?" The younger woman's mask slipped further. "Or did you simply see an opportunity and seize it? Some might call that opportunistic. Others might use less flattering terms. That is enough." Frederick's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. Every conversation nearby stopped, guests turning to stare. "Lady Penelope, you overstep. I speak only truth, Your Grace. Surely you cannot expect society to simply accept this marriage without question." She gestured dismissively at Margaret, a nobody from nowhere who somehow convinced you to marry her within days of meeting. It strains credibility. Frederick released Margaret's arm and stepped forward, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "You want the truth, Lady Penelope? Let me give it to you." He turned to address the entire assembly, his bearing that of a duke accustomed to command and respect. "I sought out Margaret deliberately. I spent months researching her family, her character, her circumstances. I went to her home not because I stumbled upon her, but because I had heard of a woman who sacrificed everything for those she loved. A woman who maintained dignity in hardship, who showed strength without bitterness." The ballroom was absolutely silent now, every guest hanging on Frederick's words. "When I met her, I found someone extraordinary, someone who saw me as a man, not as a title, someone who challenged me, who made me want to be better than I was. So yes, I offered her marriage quickly, because I knew from our first conversation that she was exactly the woman I had spent years hoping to find." Frederick turned back to Margaret, his eyes blazing with emotion. "My wife is not here because she trapped me or manipulated me. She is here because I chose her, because I love her, because she is the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I will not tolerate anyone suggesting otherwise." He took Margaret's hand, raising it to his lips while maintaining eye contact with the assembled guests. Margaret is the Duchess of Ashford by right of marriage and by merit of character. Anyone who cannot accept that with grace and respect will find themselves no longer welcome in this house or in my presence. Is that understood?" The silence stretched for a heartbeat. Then, from the back of the room, an elderly Duchess Margaret had been introduced to earlier began to applaud. Others joined in, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. Within moments, the entire ballroom was applauding, all except Lady Penelope and her mother, who stood frozen in mortification. Frederick turned back to them, his voice dropping to something cold and final. "You will leave now. You are no longer welcome at Ashford Park or at any event I host. Should we encounter each other in society, you will acknowledge my wife with the respect she deserves, or you will answer to me. Do I make myself clear?" Lady Penelope's face had gone white, then red. Without a word, she turned and fled, her mother hurrying after her. The orchestra, sensing the need to restore normalcy, struck up a new dance. Frederick turned to Margaret with a smile. "May I have this dance, Your Grace? Always, Your Grace." As they moved across the floor, Margaret felt tears threatening. Frederick had just publicly declared his love before all of society. He had defended her honor without hesitation, had made it clear that she was not just accepted but cherished. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" Telling the truth. Frederick pulled her closer than propriety strictly allowed. "Margaret, you are my heart. I would burn this entire house down before I let anyone make you feel less than the extraordinary woman you are. I love you so much. I love you more." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and dances and conversations. But Margaret moved through it all with new confidence, secure in the knowledge that Frederick stood beside her, that he had claimed her publicly and irrevocably as his own. When the last guest finally departed in the early hours of morning, Frederick pulled Margaret into his arms in the empty ballroom. "You were perfect tonight," he kissed her softly. "Every inch a duchess." Margaret leaned into him, exhausted but happy. "We were perfect together, as we always will be." 6 months had passed since the ball that changed everything. Margaret stood at the window of the morning room, watching spring transform the gardens into a riot of color. The roses she had planted in the section Frederick had given her were beginning to bloom, deep crimson against emerald leaves. Her mark on Ashford Park, as permanent as the love that had grown between its Duke and Duchess. "Your Grace," Mrs. Henderson appeared at the door. "The tenants from the Western Farms have arrived for their quarterly meeting." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. I will be there shortly." The housekeeper smiled with warm affection. "If I may say so, Your Grace, you have become everything this household needed. The late Duchess would be proud." Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. The woman she had been 6 months ago would never have imagined conducting quarterly meetings with tenant farmers, managing a household staff of 40, or hosting county gatherings with the confidence of someone born to the role. But she had learned. More than that, she had thrived. The meeting went smoothly, Margaret listening to concerns about crop rotation and drainage with genuine interest. Frederick had taught her to see the estate not as property, but as a living community, and she had taken that lesson to heart. The tenants, initially skeptical of their new Duchess, had become her staunchest supporters. As the last farmer departed with a bow and genuine smile, Frederick appeared in the doorway, his eyes lit with the warmth that never failed to make her heart skip. "How did it go?" "Very well. The Harrisons are expecting their 4th child in autumn, and the Thompsons need repairs to their barn roof. I told them we would send workers next week." Frederick crossed to her, pulling her into his arms despite the impropriety of embracing in a public room. "Have I told you today that you are extraordinary?" "Only twice." Margaret wound her arms around his neck. "Surely you can do better than that." "Let me see." He kissed her forehead. "You are extraordinary." He kissed her nose. "Brilliant." Her cheek. Beautiful. Finally, her lips. And entirely mine. Margaret melted into the kiss, still marveling at how desire could continue to build between them even after months of marriage. Every touch felt new, every kiss a discovery. "Your Grace," Thompson's voice came from the doorway, carefully apologetic. "Forgive the interruption, but you have visitors." Frederick sighed against Margaret's hair. "Who?" "Your sister, Your Grace. Lady Catherine has arrived from the continent with her husband." Frederick's entire demeanor changed, lighting with genuine joy. "Catherine is here." He turned to Margaret. "You will love her, I promise. She is nothing like the rest of aristocratic society. If she is anything like you, I already know I will." An hour later, Margaret found herself embracing a woman who could only be Frederick's sister. Lady Catherine was tall like her brother, with the same grey eyes and warm smile. Her husband, Lord Edmund, was a scholarly man who clearly adored his wife. "So you are the woman who finally captured my impossible brother's heart," Catherine said, holding Margaret at arm's length to study her. "Frederick wrote that you were extraordinary. He understated the case. Coming from you, that is high praise." Frederick pulled his sister into another embrace. "I have missed you, Cat." "And I you." Catherine turned back to Margaret. "You must tell me everything. How you met, how he courted you, and most importantly, how you managed to make him forget his determination never to marry." Over dinner that evening, Margaret told the story with Frederick occasionally interjecting corrections or additional details. She found herself laughing as she described their first meeting, the awkwardness of the arranged marriage, her shock upon discovering his true identity. "You deceived her?" Catherine looked at her brother with mock severity. "Frederick James Ashford, I raised you better than that." "I was desperate," Frederick defended himself. "Every woman I met saw only the title, and Margaret saw the man." Catherine's expression softened. "That is exactly what you needed, what you have always needed." The days that followed were filled with joy. Catherine and Edmund stayed for 2 weeks, and Margaret discovered the gift of family she had feared lost when she left her childhood home. Letters from her father and siblings had been regular and warm, the family's circumstances dramatically improved by Frederick's quiet financial support. But having Catherine there, someone who treated her as a beloved sister rather than a duchess, filled a void Margaret had not realized existed. On the morning of their departure, Catherine pulled Margaret aside. "Take care of him. My brother can be stubborn and proud, but underneath he has the softest heart of anyone I know. You have given him something I feared he would never find. Happiness, home." Catherine squeezed her hands. "Frederick has lived in this house all his life, but it was never truly a home until you arrived. Thank you for that." After they left, Margaret found Frederick in the library, staring out at the gardens with an expression of contentment she had come to treasure. "Missing them already." She moved to stand beside him. "A little, but I am grateful they came, that Catherine got to meet you." He pulled her against his side. "She told me this morning that she has never seen me so happy. Are you? Happy?" Frederick turned her to face him, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "Margaret, 6 months ago I was a man going through the motions of life, managing an estate, fulfilling duties, existing but not truly living. You changed everything." He kissed her softly. "You made me laugh again. You challenged my assumptions and forced me to see beyond my own limited perspective. You took this house that was merely a monument to family history and transformed it into a home filled with warmth and life. I could not have done it without you. We did it together." Frederick's smile was radiant. "That is what partnership means, what love means. Not one person carrying the other, but both walking side by side, supporting and strengthening each other." Margaret felt tears threaten, but smiled through them. "I came here believing I was sacrificing my life for my family. Instead, I found a life I never knew I wanted, found love I never knew existed. As did I." Frederick pulled her close, his voice dropping to the intimate tone reserved only for her. "Every day with you is a gift, Margaret. Every moment a treasure. I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that circumstances brought you to my door." They stood together in the library as afternoon light slanted through the windows, 2 people who had begun as strangers, bound by necessity, and had become lovers, bound by choice. The deception that had started their story had long since been forgiven, replaced by a truth more powerful than any lie. That night, as they lay tangled together in the ducal bed that had become theirs in every sense, Margaret traced lazy patterns on Frederick's chest. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Not telling me the truth from the beginning?" Frederick was silent for a moment, considering. "I regret that it hurt you, but I cannot regret the path that led us here. If I had revealed my identity immediately, you would have refused me out of fear, or accepted out of desperation. Neither would have given us the chance to fall in love, so the end justified the means." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "No, but the end transformed the means into something else entirely. What began as deception became the foundation for honesty. What started as a transaction became the deepest love I have ever known." Margaret kissed him softly. "I love you, Frederick. Not because you are a duke, not because of this house or the title or the wealth. I love you because you are kind and honorable, because you see me as I truly am and love me anyway, because you make me laugh and challenge me to be better. I love you, Margaret." Frederick pulled her closer. "For the rest of my life and beyond, I will love you." As Margaret drifted towards sleep, wrapped in her husband's arms, she thought of the frightened woman who had arrived at Ashford Park 6 months ago. That woman had believed she was trading freedom for survival, that she would spend her life in a marriage of duty and resignation. How wrong she had been. She had not lost her freedom. She had found it, in the arms of a man who valued her choices, who encouraged her strength, who loved her not despite who she was, but because of it. The forced marriage had become a love story. The stranger had become her heart. And the house that had seemed like a prison had transformed into a home filled with laughter, passion, and a future bright with promise. Margaret closed her eyes, perfectly content, and let sleep claim her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight, she simply rested in the knowledge that she was loved, that she was home, and that the best decision she had ever made was saying yes to a stranger who had seen in her everything she had yet to see in herself. Some journeys begin in darkness and end in light. Margaret's path led her from resignation to joy, from duty to desire, from sacrifice to love freely given. She learned that home is not a place but a person, that strength comes not from enduring alone, but from choosing to trust. And in the end, she discovered that the greatest gift is not being saved, but being seen, valued, and loved for exactly who you are. I hope this story touched your heart the way it touched mine while creating it. If you enjoyed following Margaret and Frederick's journey from strangers to soulmates, please leave a like on this video. It truly helps me continue creating these stories for you. And I would love to know, where in the world are you listening to this story from? Drop your location in the comments below. Hearing from all of you across the globe reminds me why I love what I do. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for letting these characters into your heart. Until the next story, may you find your own love worth fighting for.